Good afternoon to everyone. I apologize for a few minutes being late, and I also apologize for the lighting. I'm sitting in my office with the sun coming in, and I expect that will change. So it'll get better. Well, we tried some alternative locations for me, and trust me, this is the best. I received a number of questions before the meetup, and so I'm going to go through those questions. If you want me to answer a question, please send it to me. Declan, would you explain how folks can get questions?
Yes, so you can submit questions in the Facebook live chat. You can email them to chairmancs@dccouncil.gov, or you can send them to one of the chairman's social media accounts. On Facebook, that's Chairman Phil Mendelson. Instagram, also Chairman Phil Mendelson. And Twitter is CHMN Mendelson.
Thank you. And next month, we're going to try to do this in person on a Saturday morning. We haven't picked a location yet. I believe it will be March 18th, if that's a Saturday. So let me go through these questions, and then we'll repeat again how you can send questions to us, but I'll answer questions that we get during this meetup when I finish these. So the first question, and to be honest with you, I haven't looked at any of these questions yet. How can we find a middle ground between the professed need for more housing, the grave need for housing for the lower ends of MFI, a sense of community, a sense of place that is so sorely lacking for a lot of young people, and respect for historic elements in communities that help provide a sense of place? Excuse me, I don't think it's hard to find a middle ground. The only reason why there wouldn't be a middle ground between those different goals is when somebody believes that development for the purposes of housing should just occur without any regard to context or place. So if the goal is to just put a 10-story building on a single-family street, that's not going to work. But there are plenty of places in town where density is permitted, and so there are plenty of places where rather dense housing can be built. The need for housing is so great in this city. I'm speaking now my view. The need for housing is so great in this city that as long as we're producing housing, we are making positive steps. And let me add, in my working with state leaders, legislative leaders, as well as city council presidents from around the country, what I see is that the housing affordability crisis is prevalent across the country. So it is possible to develop housing and respect historic preservation and historic preservation law. It is possible to get more housing and respect the sense of place. And it is possible, particularly with the amount of government subsidy that's occurring, to get more housing and housing at the lower ends of MFI. The second question, why are Ward 3 schools overcrowded, yet schools are not overcrowded in other wards, even more empty than full? Could something be done to improve schools in other wards, such as incentivize teachers, invest in infrastructure, et cetera, so that there could be a more even distribution of students in all wards? Well, this is a pretty, I want to say a pretty simple question and therefore extremely difficult. And I mean that seriously. Schools in Ward 3 are overcrowded because schools in Ward 3 are considered to be good schools, a good quality education, and residents send their kids to the neighborhood schools in Ward 3. Unfortunately, that's not the case in our lower income neighborhoods. And so the schools aren't considered as good or as successful. And my answer is being a little simplistic here, but that would be why there are empty seats. In addition, there's a lot of competition through charter schools, and that is pulling away population from schools in lower income communities. And that's not a statement against charters. I've been a supporter and am a supporter of charter schools. What I've been struggling to do is to get the city, get DCPS, get the chancellor, get the mayor to invest more in these schools that are struggling with their enrollment. And anyone who's been paying attention the last few weeks knows that I've accused the mayor of completely disregarding the law with regard to funding schools. And so what we're seeing is that instead of schools getting the same budget next year that they had this year, that 67 out of 116 schools are being cut. And of those, a third of them are in wards 5, 7, and 8, which predominantly lower income communities. Anacostia High School is seeing its budget cut, if I remember correctly, and its enrollment drop. Beers Elementary School is actually gaining students. It's a Ward 7 school, is actually gaining students, but is seeing over $300,000 cut out of its budget. Flora Henley Elementary School in Ward 8 is seeing basically the same enrollment next year that it has this year, and yet losing $300,000. I don't understand how the chancellor thinks, or the mayor thinks, we can improve educational outcomes in those schools when their budgets are being cut. So I guess I would say my simple answer to this question is commitment from the chancellor and the mayor, true commitment to actually provide more resources to these schools that are struggling to provide a quality education and therefore are struggling to maintain their enrollment. Third question, is there an update on how DC can work with Maryland, Virginia to hold drivers accountable for breaking DC laws? I do not have an update. We do have reciprocity for some kinds of tickets. Generally generally moving violations are respected among the different states. Whoever submitted this question, you could reach out to the Transportation and Environment Committee chaired by Councilmember Charles Allen for more details. Fourth question, from my perspective and many of my constituents, some vehicle drivers seem to break laws without any repercussions. No chasing from officers, lack of resources for booting vehicles, etc., and is becoming more dangerous for pedestrians, cyclists, and other drivers more dangerous for pedestrian cyclists and other drivers who do want to abide by the law. What does the chairman recommend to curb the apparent lawlessness and driving violence behavior that seems so prevalent in the district? Well, there's an assumption here that driving has become more reckless and lawless in the district. I'm not sure that's the case. I know we have Vision Zero as a goal. I'm quite frustrated with Vision Zero programming because I don't believe the mayor or the Department of Transportation have really put the thought into implementation to focus specifically on locations and behavior that are leading to significant injuries and death. For instance, the last I checked, when I asked EDOT if they'd done an analysis of the causes of the different accidents that resulted in death or serious injury, they had not done that analysis. So changing the geography, like building bump outs and other physical changes really aren't going to make a difference if we're trying to deal with drunk driving, and strategies focused on drunk drivers would have more effect. I'm just saying that to illustrate my point. So I'm not sure I agree with the premise of the question and things have gotten worse. And I'm adding that I think that the DDOT and the mayor are not focused enough on the behaviors that are leading to these accidents. Fifth question, OSSE, that's the Office of State Superintendent for Education, OSSI continues to fail special needs families with transportation. They have metrics to show improvement, and the recent changes only made things worse. What does the chair intend to do to create accountability, and when will he hold a hearing? Well, actually, we have 2 days of hearings this week and another 2 days of hearings at the end of next month to where we will hear testimony about OSSI from residents as well as from the superintendent herself. OSSI's made some changes with its transportation. I've had a number of conversations or meetings with the superintendent. The situation was quite bad at the beginning of the year and has gotten progressively better with regard to OSSI transportation. OSSI's had a large number of call outs, meaning drivers or attendants who don't show up. And they are working to change that both through hiring more as well as dealing appropriately with those who are calling out. That's been their biggest problem, is the number of call outs. If you don't have drivers, then you don't have buses to cover certain routes. I'm not saying the situation is as good as I'm not saying the situation has been as good as it needs to be. It's gotten better, and I'm optimistic that it will continue to improve. Question 6, what are you doing to ensure that the DCPS chancellor and DCPS comply with the law and schools get their legally mandated funding? We've had 2 hearings with the chancellor. The second hearing involved public testimony as well. That was last week and the week before. With regard to funding schools, I've made it clear, both through letters and hearings, that the mayor and the chancellor are required to comply with the law. Some folks have suggested we sue. I have given consideration to that, and I don't believe that a suit would be very successful because a court will say that the council is the final decision maker with regard to the budget. And so we have the opportunity to ensure that schools are funded according to the law. So I don't believe that based on what I've seen thus far, I don't believe that the courts are a solution to the current situation. I think that publicly shaming the mayor and the chancellor for violating the law is the approach we have to take. And that this is, I don't mean to make light of it, a work in progress. But to me, it's pretty shocking that the chancellor thinks that it's fine for public education for schools to get a 5% increase in the DCPS to get a 5% increase in its budget, but 67 out of 116 schools are getting cut. And just to add a little bit, the deputy mayor for education said it's not 67 schools, it's 44. And when we asked what the difference was, it was because he didn't include any one-time funding that schools got in the current year in calculating whether there was a reduction next year. To explain that, in case that didn't make sense. So if a school got, let's say, $500,000 in one-time funding in the current year, then taking that money out, not repeating it next year, is not a cut. That didn't make sense is because it doesn't make sense. As I said at the hearing to the chancellor, he was gaslighting the council and the public. And let me add one other thing. You know, the separation of powers doctrine is such that the council does not run the schools. We can put requirements on the schools, such as you will budget them a certain way, but implementation is up to the mayor. That's always been the way. And so that's part of our challenge here. Question 7, due to DCPS violation of schools first in budgeting, too many schools face budget reductions that will cut the very staff that directly impact learning. I agree. Can the council cut from the 850 plus DCPS central office staff before teachers? DC spends more on central office staff per pupil than anywhere else in the United States. I don't know whether that's factually correct, the last sentence, but I do know that when DCPS had half the had double the students it has today. When DCPS had about 100,000 students, today it has about 50,000. It had about 300 fewer staff at central office. So yes, theoretically, the council can cut central office. I can assure you that if we do that, we will hear such screams of undercutting necessary services. In fact, I saw that with Schools First in Budgeting, where there were some who've been quite active with regard to improving schools, who were afraid, very afraid, that Schools First in Budgeting would hurt central and therefore hurt necessary functions. I'm not saying we won't do it. Don't read that into what I'm saying. I'm just saying that it's not easy to do, because there will be a lot of criticism that the cuts to central are cuts to necessary services. Is there any plan to deal with all the fake temporary tags in DC? Why should my family go through the expensive and extremely burdensome process of registering a car in DC if there are zero consequences for having a fake or expired temporary tag? Well, first of all, they're not zero consequences. It may be true that some people get by with it. There are a whole lot of folks who don't get by with it. So there's a reason why your family should go through the expensive and extremely burdensome process of registering your car. A year ago, bought a new car and registered it. I didn't find it extremely burdensome, but I don't want to take away the point that it should be easy for any individual who wants to be legitimate to register their car. I absolutely believe that the regulatory process should be easy on residents. With regard to a specific plan, I don't have oversight over Department of Motor Vehicles. The questioner should go to the Committee on Transportation and Environment. Ninth question, what is your plan to address air contamination in rental housing due to secondhand exposure to cigarettes and other substances? Well, that's an interesting question. There was a constituent with whom I corresponded maybe a year ago about this issue. You know, we're at an interesting time in our society where we are increasingly decriminalizing or legalizing drugs like marijuana, which most people smoke, and yet very critical of cigarette smoking, which used to be completely legal and widespread. And so it's almost like we want to make cigarette smoking illegal while letting cannabis smoking be legal. I don't know how we deal with tenants who want to smoke in their apartments, in their homes, when neighbors are complaining that the smoke is annoying or unhealthy. I don't have an answer there. I'm not of a view that we should make cigarette smoking in somebody's home illegal. 10th question, what is the status of getting SROs back in schools? Last week during an oversight hearing, Chief Conti said removing them is one of the biggest mistakes DC has made. Well, I agree that we should not get rid of the SROs. I think there's still about 60, but there used to be maybe twice that number. Last year, I supported legislation to restore SROs. In 2020, I believe the vote of the council was unanimous to phase them out. Last year, my effort failed on an 8-5 vote. That means there were 5 council members, including myself, who agreed that SROs should be kept. I believe we will try again this year. I just co-introduced a bill with Councilmember Trayon White to get SROs back in schools. If any of you listening or participating agree with me, reach out to council members and lobby them. Actually, if you disagree with me, you have that right as well. But I'm of a view that the SROs are misunderstood. They're not police stationed in schools, sort of like occupying the schools. Rather, a police officer is specially trained to work with kids and is assigned several schools. And so that police officer trained to work with kids becomes familiar with kids in different schools and becomes familiar with several schools and helps the principals with regard to often public safety issues outside the school, like safe passage. There's a value to school resource officers, and it's not like untrained regular police officers. If there's an incident in a school, but again, SROs typically deal with incidents outside the school. But if there is an incident inside the school, I'd rather have an SRO who's trained to work with kids be there than untrained cops be the first responders. 11th question, in your interview with WTOP, I was very surprised to hear you say that the council governed by sentiment in 2020 when Charles Allen cut funding to MPD and instituted a hiring freeze. With MPD staffing levels so low, will you be supporting Vince Gray's police staffing bill, or at least let the bill have a hearing? Interesting. Well, first of all, I have no control over whether the bill will have a hearing. That's not the kind of council that I run as chairman, where members cannot have hearings unless I approve. Second, Vince Gray's bill does much more than try to increase police. For instance, it removes police accountability by let's see, Vince Gray's bill reduces police accountability in two ways. First of all, it repeals the creation of a deputy auditor for public safety. That was an accountability measure that we put in the law, that there is a position specifically in the DC auditor's office to look at public safety, an accountability mechanism. And also, Vince Gray's bill would repeal the prohibition on police officers negotiating their own discipline. That is a major reform, that police can no longer bargain their discipline. And what we've seen across the country is that over the years, police departments, including here, have come up with such complicated disciplinary processes that bad cops cannot be easily removed from the force. So no, I don't support those provisions. I think that bill's a step backward in that regard. And I don't know what the correct staffing level is. I do believe the current number of police officers is too low. I'm very clear about that. I believe Chief Conti testified the other day to increase this number of sworn officers to the level that Vince Gray's bill calls for. Would take about 10 years. So I'm not sure that Vince Gray's bill is a solution in that regard either. But I did say that in 2020, when George Floyd was murdered, that there was tremendous pressure across the country to defund police. The council did not defund the police department, but did make some small cuts. Small meaning out of a $500 or $600 million budget. If I remember correctly, there was a reduction of maybe about 10 million. But that's not where the council is today, nor is that where I am today. And in fact, the council's sentiments shifted as long ago as in 2021. So just to be clear, I do support increasing the number of sworn officers, and I do believe that the current level is too low. 12th question, I believe I have heard the chairman say that eminent domain takes effect immediately once passed, meaning that if eminent domain were to be invoked, it would not in and of itself cause delay in actualizing any project. I also understand that the courts would convene a jury to decide upon a reasonable price if the owner were not able to come to an agreement with the city. This need not take long, especially if a recent sale had established a market value as with the Wardman. But the city could take possession and even begin construction upon approval of eminent domain legislation. Is this correct? No. So there are two kinds of eminent domain. One is a quick take, where the district files papers necessary to take title and then goes to court to negotiate the price. And the other is a longer process where the government goes to court but negotiates the price and then takes title. I'm not sure that matters with regard to the questioner. I think the questioner is really asking about the Wardman. The Wardman This is the Wardman Park Hotel site in Ward 3 in Woodley Park. Number of individuals have been advocating that the city acquire the land for affordable housing. I think that's a laudable idea, but not practical for a couple of reasons. First of all, the council can authorize eminent domain as often as it wants to, with as many projects as it wants to. The decision to implement eminent domain is exclusively the mayor's. We have been told, I've been told repeatedly, that the council cannot require the mayor to exercise eminent domain. The mayor has consistently shown that she's not interested in exercising eminent domain at the Wardman Park site. And even if she were, it would have an impact on our budget of, I'm guessing, around $100 million as the value of that property. I might be off by, let's just say, $50 million. We do not have $50 million in our capital budget to acquire that property. Now, the budget will be coming to us next month, so the council would have the opportunity, the ability to cut some program to fund acquisition of the Wardman Park. Two things are necessary. One is the willingness on the part of a majority of council members to cut some other programs to come up with the money. And then second of all, a commitment from the mayor that she actually would go forward to spend it. We've been through this for the last couple of years, and until the mayor shows that willingness to take the land and to take the land and acquire it, there's no point in the council trying to fund it. 13th question, Central is worse than ever. Voicemail as of a few months ago was from March 2020, citing a COVID lockdown. No one can get a license renewed, benefits updated, maternity leave approved. Parents can't get cleared for field trips, new hires take months. Teachers email HR and never hear back. Can't get through on a call, they literally fail to complete the most basic tasks. They haven't updated our 2023 ELA resources since Unit 1. How can we hold them accountable for this mess? I'm not sure, but I think this deals with DCPS Central, It doesn't say that. I have been pressing the chancellor for 3 months to improve HR. We changed the law last fall with regard to background checks, which would speak to the clearance process. I don't know about licenses renewed. I don't think the chancellor has been tending to basic organizational needs like HR in DCPS. And I've made that quite clear. Even most recently, as this afternoon, talking to the chief financial officer about potential discipline over procurement. Accountability comes from sunshine, that is making this stuff, putting this stuff out in the open. That's why we have a hearing tomorrow on DCPS. And we've had other hearings and we'll continue to have hearings on schools as a way to try to hold the chancellor accountable. 14th question, can the council amend the Whistleblower Protection Act to empower judges to protect those who report abuse by stopping retaliation in its tracks? The Whistleblower Protection Act must be modified to state that a whistleblower doesn't need to plead or prove irreparable harm to be entitled to injunctive relief to stop retaliation, and that a judge shall intercede and issue appropriate temporary injunctive relief upon a showing of likelihood of success on the merits of a whistleblower claim. This sounds like a fairly technical, fairly technical, the point or complaint. Yes, the council can amend the law. I'm not sure what amendments are necessary. The Whistleblower Protection Act is clear that retaliation is not permitted. The fact that it's not permitted doesn't stop some folks from breaking the law. Typically, that gets worked out through litigation. Over time and again, I've seen where courts have, in the case of the government, fined the government substantial amounts of money as punishment for retaliation and to try to make the whistleblower whole with regard to losses for whistleblowing. I think the issue here is trying to prevent it before it occurs. And that's a little bit like our criminal code where we make it clear what people can't do and they do it and then they have to be taken to court. I wish there was a better way to be able to prevent people from breaking the law in the first place. So if there's more specifics to what the questioner wants, you should reach out to my office. Question 15, Mr. Mendelson, when will you and the DC Council decide to legislate toward bringing down crime and protecting your constituents by supporting police and prosecutions? It's the DC Council's fault that Congress has to act to protect DC residents. Well, first of all, I believe strongly that if we want to reduce crime, what we have to do is focus more deliberately on what I call swift and certain justice. And that means closing cases, closing more cases, closing them quickly. So that means more resources for police officers to enable detectives to close cases, make sure their caseloads aren't too high, but also ensure there's adequate training so that when they do close cases, that the prosecutors will prosecute those cases. I'm unaware that the council doesn't support prosecutions. But I think that what the questioner is really saying is that the criminal code reform is endangering public safety, and that's why Congress has to act to protect DC residents. I could not disagree more with that. Sentencing research is thick and deep that sentences themselves are not a deterrent to crime. I know it kind of sounds like they would be, but Exhibit A would be, we have a mandatory minimum in the law right now for first-degree homicide, 30-year mandatory minimum for first-degree homicide. Does that stop shootings? Does that stop murders? No. Sentencing serves other purposes. A person who commits a crime must be punished, and there must be a sentence behind it. But deterrence is not one of those purposes of sentencing. There are a lot of folks who have been saying that the criminal code reform is soft on crime, but when you start to look at it more carefully, that is not the case. So, for example, there's a criticism of the second look provisions in the criminal code reform, but my staff was telling me today that West Virginia, so at the second look in the criminal code reform is, I think after 15 years, a person who's been convicted of a crime can petition a court to take a second look at the sentence. That's a little different than parole. In West Virginia, an individual is eligible for parole after serving a quarter to 1/3 of their sentence, depending on the severity. So if it's a 30-year sentence, after 10 years, they're eligible for parole. In the district, that's not the case. Or let's take armed carjacking, that we reduced the maximum from our armed carjacking. It's now 24 years. In Arizona, home to one of our congressional critics, the maximum for armed carjacking is 12 years, half of what our maximum is. I see this over and over with regard to provisions in our criminal code, revised criminal code, that folks are complaining about. Did you compare it with other states? And other states have lesser maximums. So I don't agree that the criminal code is making the district less safe. What is your 16th question? What is your reaction to the UDC President Mason's answers to my questions yesterday on the status of the new archives to be built at UDC? I'm concerned that my reaction is I'm concerned that the Executive Office of the mayor's senior staff have not been moving very diligently or deliberatively to get the new archives off the ground. It's supposed to be located at UDC. A building's been identified. There have to be plans, and then it has to go through the approval processes and then construction. We've had money in the budget for years, and the mayor's office has yet to follow through. 17th question, a recent story in the Washington Post based on a FOIA of DC Housing Authority proves that DC is overpaying landlords millions of dollars per year to house voucher recipients. The story gives one example of the Housing Authority paying $2,500 in rent for a one-bedroom apartment in an area where the median rent is $1,600. These overpayments likely drive up rents for non-voucher recipients, making housing less affordable for DC residents. Should the Housing Authority stop overpayments for apartments currently rented to voucher recipients, lowering monthly rent payments to market rates? Should the Housing Authority require landlords to pay back past overcharges for these apartments? So let me see, answer. Should the Housing Authority stop overpayments for rents? In my view, yes. I think there are a number of bad consequences from these higher than market rents that DC Housing Authority have been paying, including reducing the amount of money that they have, the Housing Authority has, to support other tenants in need of housing. Should the Housing Authority require landlords to pay back past overcharges? My answer is no, because those were legitimately charged by the landlord. The government agreed to pay too much. So the landlord's entitled to what they've been paid. That doesn't mean they're entitled to continue getting paid that amount, however. I have 4 more questions, and I'll turn to whatever's been sent. As the city continues to expand voucher amounts, the program is filling up buildings which were once wonderful places to live with mentally ill, that were once wonderful places to live, filling them up with mentally ill, not ready to be housed in the community-based individual housing. These programs are ruining our lives. Drug dealers, knives in the hallways, late night door knocking in search of drugs and money. Where are the non-voucher tenant representatives on the Housing Authority board? Well, the council with the mayor streamlined the Housing Authority board, but there are, I believe, not 2 non-voucher tenant representatives on the board of a smaller board. But that's not the answer here. The answer is the district needs to enforce order with its tenants. Those would be those tenants who have vouchers. So if there is a voucher tenant who is disrupting the peace with illegal drugs or knives in hallways or late night door knocking in search of drugs or money, the Housing Authority should step in and, if necessary, remove the tenant. There are other strategies as well, not for those specific actions, but more generally, such as an individual who may be mentally ill, that the district should be providing wraparound services. In many cases, these vouchers are supposed to come with services. I don't want to defend this because I know the problem, and the problem comes from paying these higher rents, from an overconcentration of vouchers in these buildings. It reminds me of a problem that we had on the GW campus years ago with GW filling up Columbia Plaza with students and displacing regular tenants, adult tenants in the building. The Housing Authority has a responsibility, in my view, to ensure order and to not be making these buildings unpleasant or uncomfortable for other tenants. 19th question, are you planning to overturn the will of the voters again and undo the increase in the RIPT minimum wage? I'm not sure what a RIPT minimum wage is. I think I've been asked this, or maybe it's tipped minimum wage. I'm kind of getting tired of being asked this question. I have said repeatedly for over a year that I have no intention of overturning the initiative that was adopted last year. I mean, I've said this for easily since January of 2022. Anyway, I transmitted the bill to the Hill and for the necessary congressional review, and there's been no action in the council to overturn the will of the voters. So, yeah, I'm a little annoyed with that question. Question 20. I'm a Ward 7 resident, and my kids attend Payne Elementary. As a PAVE parent, I want to make sure all families in all schools in DC have access to quality out-of-school time programs, prioritizing those with the most need. How would you work to create a central location for parents to access and sign up for OST, that's out-of-school time programs, in an equitable way that prioritizes students with the greatest needs, like the lottery, ensuring that spots are not only available to the lucky few? Well, we will be having a hearing later this year on out-of-school time programming, and we have the budget coming to us next month, and we'll have a hearing with the deputy mayor who has oversight of the out-of-school time programs. So we'll be looking at this issue. I do believe that families without a lot of economic resources must have access to quality out-of-school time programs. In other words, that their financial situation should not preclude them from out-of-school time programming. I believe that's important. As for creating a central location to sign up for out-of-school time programs, I don't know that that's the best approach, since sometimes out-of-school time programming is school-based. But I do agree that spots should not be available only to the lucky few. So we'll be looking at that, as well as the adequacy of resources with the upcoming budget. The last question I have, before I read this question, Declan, could you repeat again how people can submit questions?
Yep. You can put them in the chat on Facebook, or you can send them to chairmancs@dccouncil.gov, or send them as a message to one of the chairman's social media accounts.
So the last question I have before I turn to other questions is, my kids attend Bruce Monroe Elementary School. I chose that school because we were excited to attend a dual language school in our neighborhood. We want to see improved information sharing about out-of-school time programs and cost-saving options. How will you work with the Deputy Mayor for Education and the out-of-school time office to create a community advisory committee of parents, educators, students, and other stakeholders that is diverse and fairly compensated to improve information sharing for these programs? Well, I think this is the first I'm hearing of creating a community advisory committee. I'm certainly open to looking at that. I certainly want to make sure, and this kind of follows on the previous question, that information about out-of-school time programming is shared widely, and that residents or parents, especially those without a lot of money, have access to out-of-school time programs. And I do believe that oftentimes decision-making benefits from having a diverse group of stakeholders being part of the decision-making process. Declan, why don't you give me questions you've got?
Sure. So we've gotten a couple of questions in the chat, as well as a whole lot of questions emailed to us. So we'll try to get to as many as possible. The first question from the chat: I watched the oversight hearing on the Department of Buildings. First, thank you for hosting a very informative hearing and asking important questions of this newly formed agency. Listening to those testifying, it gave the sense that we went back in time, let's say 2 years, when it was DCRA oversight hearings of 2020 and 2021. What are your thoughts about why that is?
Let me first say, I agree that it felt like we'd gone back in time. I'm not sure why. I believe that the DCRA was challenged by a workplace culture that was not committed to mission. Breaking up the agency was intended to give an opportunity for a new, fresh start. I have been disappointed that the mayor doesn't seem to have embraced that. And so we're continuing with many of the same personnel. And I don't know that I have a better answer at this point, except I don't think that the mayor believes that the Department of Buildings and its predecessor DCRA were as troubled as they were, even though from time to time she would announce important initiatives to improve the process. Next.
Next question has a couple of parts. ANCs are supported by the OANC, who has no power to enforce any rules or laws other than withholding allotments. If the ANC does not tell the public of an adverse action against them, how does the public find out something's going on within the ANC? Additionally, how does a subpoena for an ANC meeting or a FOIA request get enforced if the ANC and/or commissioner simply ignores it? And lastly, can an ANC ban members of the public from attending meetings?
An ANC is not allowed to ban members from attending a meeting. Enforcement of FOIA, there's a process in the law, and that process includes an appeal. And if the appeal, I think it's an administrative appeal, and if the administrative appeal is successful and not complied with, then there's access to the courts. I get it that that's cumbersome, but that is the law, and I don't know that there's a better process. Part of the challenge with ANCs is that the stakes generally are not as high as with, let's say, the council or an executive agency. I don't know that with regard to the Office of ANCs that it should have additional enforcement authority. I don't know what that would look like. Generally, compliance with the law. Well, I don't even know what we're talking about here. The ability to withhold quarterly allotments is fairly powerful. The a challenge with the law and with any agency is that in the end, it's up to the individuals to comply with the law, and whether that's producing documents under a FOIA or being allowing the public to attend. If somebody doesn't care to respect the law, meaning an ANC or an ANC commissioner doesn't care to respect the law, it's not possible to prevent that. It is only possible to respond to that, to react to that. And obviously that's not the ideal approach. That's not what we want. But I don't know that there's a better solution. Next, Declan.
Next question. Will you continue to deal out vouchers so buildings in DC become destroyed? More and more people are talking about leaving DC over this. You've slashed services and destroyed the lives of renters.
Okay, I kind of spoke to this earlier. first of all, the council did not cut services. We have put a lot of money into the voucher program. The voucher program is supposed to include wraparound services. If the Housing Authority or Department of Human Services is not providing those wraparound services, perhaps they're blaming the council, but the council's not at fault. It is those agencies that are not doing what they're supposed to do. As I indicated before, it's not, the council has not intended that there be an overconcentration or that higher than market rate rents are paid. That is not what the council directed. I would say that the way the programs have been implemented has been problematic. That includes the lack of wraparound resources and the paying of higher rents, higher than market rents. And in the end, that's the mayor's responsible with regard to the Department of Human Services, and the Housing Authority, which is independent, is responsible. Next.
Next, this one's from email. Will you commit to introducing or sponsoring legislation to eliminate the provision that limits retroactive pay only to those on the district's payroll as of the date of council ratification? As you are aware, these provisions harshly penalize many who have worked for DC. Many employee contracts are not renewed in timely fashion, and with the additional time lag until obtaining council approval, thousands of district teachers, police, and other workers have had to forfeit their pay raises in violation of the city's law and policy of equal pay for equal work.
First of all, I will not commit to introducing or supporting such legislation. Second of all, I think that the questioner is attempting to get at the teachers' contract and teachers who left, and I don't know what the fiscal impact would be of that, and so I'm not committing to support that at this time. Third of all, I'm not aware of this being a problem with other contracts, only with the teachers' contract, because it had, I believe, was roughly 4 years retroactive, and the other contracts have been more timely. And I believe the number of teachers is 1,000, not thousands, plural. And fourth, I would say that what really needs to happen here is that these contracts get negotiated on time. I'm quite critical of the chancellor and the mayor for not pressing to get the teacher's contract negotiated timely. The contract expired in 2019, if I remember correctly, and it should have been negotiated in 2019 or 2020, not in 2023. That's the problem here. And I have pressed, I'm trying to remember, I know I've pressed the executive at the hearing on the teacher's contract, but since then, about what they're doing to make sure that the next contract is negotiated more quickly. That's the solution here, is getting these contracts negotiated quickly. Next.
Another emailed question. Washington Gas and Light is looking for a buyer, which gives DC a huge opportunity at this crucial moment. The district could buy out the company and move swiftly to phase out natural gas entirely, ensuring the district makes a rapid and just transition to electrification. Do you agree this should be done? Will you support efforts to do so?
I'd have to say no. My guess is that to buy the company would cost hundreds of millions, if not more. I don't know where we get the money for that. And I believe the proposition is that we would buy out the company and then put it out of business. And while the goal, I get the goal, which is that we want to move toward electrification and get away from fossil fuels, the district is already spending a lot of money through a number of strategies to reduce our carbon footprint, to put hundreds of millions of dollars additional into that. I don't know how we afford to do that. I don't know how we do that. So it's an interesting idea, but I don't see how that could work. It could work from a financial point of view. Let me be clear. To spend hundreds of millions to buy a company to put it out of business, when we have so many other competing demands for our money, like affordable housing or improving public education. Next.
How can there be greater accountability for DGS? My school has a number of door and key work orders that have gone unresolved or improperly fixed. For example, teacher doors do not lock properly. Key fob does not work on the front door. It is unsafe, and the excuse that is given is that there is one locksmith that handles DCPS. What are our options?
Well, I'm going to start with how do we hold DGS more accountable? So I put a new council member in charge of oversight of DGS. And I'm expecting that Councilmember Lewis George is going to spend a lot of time oversight of DGS because that's what she has done for the last couple of years. This is the challenge. People think that the council runs the government. The council does not run the government. I have had monthly meetings with DGS to try to get them to do better with school maintenance, to improve their school maintenance, to be responsive to school maintenance. Over and over, I have publicly cited the situation with doors in particular. I don't know that it's that they have one locksmith. I do know that it's that DGS is borderline incompetent with its work orders. And so this is the age-old struggle with separation of powers, that the legislature, the tools to the legislature are oversight and legislation, but you can't legislate quality. And DGS chooses not to be more efficient with how it handles school work orders. And so we keep hammering away, me with my frequent meetings, a new oversight chair, and we will just keep hammering away to get DGS to improve.
Next question. Chairman, would you support a cross-subsidization plan akin to social housing as a way to create more affordable housing on city-owned land? What are your thoughts generally about these innovative solutions? What do you need to see in order to be supportive?
We already do a lot of cross-subsidization with development of housing on government land that we are disposing either by sale or by lease, long-term lease. Cross-subsidization is where you have, for example, market rate units that are bringing in more revenue to help subsidize the lower income or extremely low income units. We also subsidize through discounting the value of the land, either in the lease or a conveyance of title. Cross-subsidization is an approach that's alive and well. Next question.
From the Facebook chat, does the council intend to close the disclosure loopholes in the independent expenditure regulations that enable IE committees to inject large amounts of money into local elections and to not disclose those expenditures until after the elections?
I love these very specific questions. This is not something that I've looked at recently. I think that question should be directed at Councilmember Bonds, who has oversight of elections this council period. We are unable to limit IE expenditures. That's constitutional. But IE expenditures by law have to be independent. That's so, and that they have to be independent. Because they're independent, we're unable to limit the amount. With regard to disclosure, I guess, let me just speak generally. I think disclosure is important. I believe that the IE campaigns are required to file disclosure reports on the same timetable as candidates, I believe. Maybe the questioner is getting at the source of funds that the IE campaign gets. And I don't know what's permitted in that regard. And I don't know that I can give a better answer at this point. Declan?
I do see 2 more questions in the chat, and then we've had 4 questions emailed to us if you have time for them.
Yeah, that'll be the limit.
Okay. Next one. What are you doing to make cyclists get license plates, register, and get insurance for their bikes if they're going to be riding in the street? Most of them are running pedestrians down in the crosswalks and getting away with it.
License plates have been shown to be completely ineffective. We used to require license plates, and the number of bicycles on the street, the number that had licenses was like infinitesimal compared to the number of bicycles, total number of bicycles. It's completely ineffective. We changed the law a number of years ago to provide a registration campaign. I don't think that's what the questioner is interested in. The questioner is interested in enforcement of bad bicyclists, and license plates isn't going to do it. That's a whole nother conversation about police priorities, and but license plates isn't going to do it. I think that answered the question, Declan.
Yep.
Next.
Next, what will you do to make sure that my neighborhood, South Capitol Hill, has access to library services during the 2, 3, or 4 years my branch, the Southeast branch, will be closed starting this summer?
Well, I'm not familiar with those development plans specifically. One could reach out to the committee that has oversight over recreation, libraries, and youth affairs. That's Tran White, or contact the library, or just ask the Southeast Library what the plan is. I'd be surprised if it's 3 or 4 years. It's usually less time than that. Building these new libraries, I think, is a great thing, and they're a great resource for the community. Yes, there'll be some disruption, but as for specific plans for that library, I don't know. Next.
Next. All of these programs for free bus service and free metro sound wonderful, but where are the funds coming from? Increasing taxes on actual resident taxpayers, while those who are not seeking employment get more benefits without asking them for anything in return.
Overwhelmingly, residents want to see public transit and public transit be healthy and accessible. Overwhelmingly, when Metro wants to raise fares, there's criticism, widespread criticism, that raising fares will reduce ridership, and it's true. So what the council did last fall, working on legislation that would subsidize DC residents using public transit, a form of reducing fares, was we realized that it was cheaper, literally cheaper, to provide free bus fare. Fare-free bus service in the District of Columbia. It benefits primarily district residents because our bus routes are entirely within the district. And it should increase ridership, which is what folks have been complaining about for years. If we increase ridership, we ought to be reducing traffic congestion because there'll be fewer vehicles. If we increase fewer motor vehicles, single occupancy vehicles, if we increase ridership, we may actually find that we have to increase service. In other words, instead of having a bus every 10 minutes, we'll have a bus every 5 minutes, for example. That's a good thing. This is a service, but it also is good in terms of the transportation network overall, bus versus automobiles and traffic congestion. It's also good for the environment to have more people using buses than private passenger vehicles. But more than that, it's an equity issue. Overwhelmingly, low-income folks depend on public transit far more than affluent residents, and low-income residents are the primary users, not the sole, primary users of bus service in the district. Frankly, what I've seen in other jurisdictions, even in the district, is that affluent individuals will use buses if it's convenient, and increasing ridership, increasing frequency should have that effect. I see only wins with free fare bus service. We're not raising taxes to fund it. I repeat, we are not raising taxes to fund it. We paid for it already out of last year's revenue growth. Revenues exceeded what we had budgeted. And so we use that excess revenue to fund the fare-free bus service on a continuing basis. When I said revenue growth, I mean revenue growth as projected last year over the life of the financial plan. So it's paid for, not having to raise taxes. And I will add as well that the cost of the fare-free bus service is about $35 million. And I say that because I've heard much higher figures cited, and those are inaccurate. Next question.
I see 3 final questions before we wrap up. The next one is the council considering buying the Intelsat Whittle property for use as a K through 12 middle school and high school in Ward 3? The Ward 3 school board member told an ANC meeting that he wanted to do that to relieve overcrowding in Ward 3 schools.
Interesting question. Is the council considering it right now? No. We get the budget in a month on March 22nd, and I'm pretty sure that at least one council member will bring this up. So yes, we will consider it then. Interesting in part because earlier there was a question about the Wardman Park. So the Wardman Park, I'm guessing it would cost about 100 million. And the Whittle School, which is the old Intelsat building, which is next to UDC, I'm guessing it would cost about 100 million. I could be off. I could be off by 50 million. Maybe Intelsat is 150 and Wardman is 50. In any event, we don't have money for all of this. We don't even have money for any of it. So it goes to the point, though, of competing demands for our money. The council could cut other capital programs to fund these. So we'll look at this. I think the idea, I've heard a number of suggestions regarding the Intelsat property, which the Whittle School was there for a short time, to use the property to house several charter schools. I don't know if several charter schools have volunteered for that, to use the property to house a new high school, and then maybe discontinue the one on MacArthur Boulevard that hasn't opened. I'm not sure that that's the right solution. So there has to be some clarity as to what the use would be. And then it comes back to what I said earlier regarding Wardman. The mayor has got to be willing to purchase the building before I would be willing to see it in the budget. And in order for it to get into the budget, we would have to cut funding for something else. Those are both very big hurdles, the mayor's commitment and finding the money. Next question.
Next question. What is your position on the Vulnerable Youth Guardianship Protection Amendments Act of 2023, which was reintroduced from the previous year? The bill has never had a hearing, but is sorely needed to connect a misalignment between DC law and federal law that is preventing immigrants from applying for the special immigrant juvenile status, which gives access to a special humanitarian visa for youth who have been abused, abandoned, or neglected.
I'm not very familiar with this bill because it's in a different committee than the one that I chair. I believe there should be a hearing on the bill and to better understand whether there might be some reasons not to move forward. I'm not saying there are, as well as to understand what the cost, if any, there would be if we adopted the bill. I don't know why it didn't have a hearing last year or in the last 2 years. And I think that would be completely appropriate to have a hearing on. Next.
So there's one more question I see, but if we did miss any questions, please feel free to email them to chairmancs@dccouncil.gov and we can respond. But the last question I see in the Facebook chat is, if an ANC bans someone from a meeting, what recourse does the banned member of the public have to force the ANC to allow members of the public back into their meetings?
Unfortunately, that's a difficult question. The ANC does not have a right to ban somebody unless the person is so disruptive. And then I think it's a question of, maybe turning to some other public safety authorities. So the ANC does not have the authority to ban somebody. The ANC, the Office of ANC's OANC could inform the ANC that the ANC has to let the person attend. I want to say the council member could inform the ANC, but I don't really want to put it on the council member. The council member getting involved would help, but it's a little unfair to ask a council member to do something like that, because that's really much more of an enforcement and therefore executive function, not legislative. If it persists, maybe the banned member could press the OANC about withholding allotment. I'm not sure there's authority for that, but that could be worth looking at. I'm not quite sure how the ANC could keep a banned person out of the meeting unless it's a Zoom meeting. In which case, maybe go to the Attorney General's office. I don't know. I mean, usually an ANC doesn't ban, and if it does ban, it usually backs down when it's told it can't. And if it doesn't back down when it's told it can't, then I don't know that it's ever gone farther than that. But if it does, I would just keep upping the pressure. Declan, are we done?
I believe so. And if we did miss any, again, please feel free to email them to our constituent services team and I will follow up.
I want to thank everybody. As I said before, I think our next meetup is in mid-March. We'll get the notice out and I believe it will be in person. Does that sound right, Pat or Declan?
Yes, that's right. That's correct.
And is it March 18th?
I believe it's the 18th. Yes.
Okay. So usually when we do it in person, it's been a few years, it's a smaller turnout and I don't get through as many questions, but it's a much more personal interaction. I kind of hate this. I just sit here at a laptop and read questions and it doesn't allow for follow-up. So I apologize for that. But I want to thank everyone who's attended and everyone who sent questions. I hope this was helpful. And I'll see some or all of you next month.